Life takes unexpected turns when you least expect it. Follow Sophie Blair's journey as she escapes her crumbling city life for what was meant to be just 1 week at her cousin's farm. Little did she know that Oak Hollow and a quiet farmer named Grant would completely transform her perspective on what truly matters. Join us for this heartwarming tale of rediscovery, healing, and finding love in the most unexpected places. Before we begin this story, comment below where you're watching us from. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of Sophie Blair's small apartment as she tossed the last of her clothes into a suitcase. At 26, she felt like her life was falling apart instead of coming together. Her boyfriend of 3 years had walked out last month, and just yesterday, the marketing firm where she worked had let her go. Budget cuts, they said. Well, at least the timing works out, Sophie muttered to herself, zipping up her bag. Her cousin Megan had called last week, desperate for someone to house-sit her farm while she took a cruise with her new husband. Sophie had agreed without much thought. 1 week away from the city that never felt like home might be exactly what she needed. After loading her car with 2 suitcases and a box of essentials, Sophie took one last look at her apartment. The lease was up at the end of the month anyway. Maybe this was the universe telling her it was time for a change. The drive to Oak Hollow took nearly 3 hours. As the city buildings gave way to rolling hills and farmland, Sophie felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. When she finally turned onto the gravel road leading to her cousin's property, she was greeted by a charming white farmhouse surrounded by towering oak trees and fields of wildflowers. "Feed the chickens, water the garden, and don't burn the place down," Sophie recited Megan's instructions as she parked her car. Simple enough. Inside, the farmhouse was cozy and welcoming, with worn but comfortable furniture and family photos covering the walls. Sophie dropped her bags in the guest room and decided to explore the property before unpacking. The chicken coop was behind the house, and beyond that was a large vegetable garden that looked like it needed watering. Sophie made a mental note to take care of that later. She continued walking, enjoying the warm afternoon sun on her face, when suddenly she collided with something solid. "Oh," she gasped, stumbling backward. Not something, someone. A tall, broad-shouldered man with deep brown eyes and a serious expression stood before her. "Sorry," he said, his voice low and rough, as if he didn't use it often. "Didn't see you coming around the corner." Sophie brushed dirt off her jeans, acutely aware of her mismatched boots. She'd packed in such a hurry she hadn't been paying attention, and the sunburn already forming on her nose and cheeks. "No, it's my fault," she said quickly. "I'm Sophie, Blair, Megan's cousin. I'm house-sitting while she's away." The man nodded slowly. "Grant Ellison, I own the farm next door." He gestured vaguely toward the east. Megan mentioned someone would be staying here. An awkward silence fell between them. Sophie shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I'm only staying for a week," she finally said, feeling the need to fill the quiet. Grant looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Stay as long as you want. Or forever." Sophie laughed nervously, certain he was joking. But Grant's face remained serious, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her heart beat a little faster. "Well, I should get back to unpacking," she said, taking a step backward. "Nice to meet you, Grant." He nodded again and turned to leave, then paused. "The coop door is broken. I noticed it yesterday. I'll come by tomorrow to fix it." Before Sophie could respond, he was walking away, his long strides carrying him quickly across the field toward what she assumed was his property. "Strange man," she murmured to herself, but there was something about him that lingered in her thoughts as she returned to the house. That evening, Sophie settled on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her phone buzzed, a text from her ex-boyfriend asking if she'd thought things through yet. She turned the phone face down without responding. 1 week, she reminded herself. Feed the chickens, water the garden, breathe for once, and leave. True to his word, Grant showed up the next morning while Sophie was struggling to herd the chickens back into their coop after feeding them. "Morning," he said, startling her. He carried a toolbox and wore a faded blue shirt that stretched across his shoulders. "Hi," Sophie replied, flustered as she chased a particularly stubborn hen. "These little monsters are a lot faster than they—" "Look!" The corner of Grant's mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. He set down his toolbox and with expert movements quickly guided the remaining chickens into the coop. "Thanks," Sophie said, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "I don't have much experience with farm animals." Grant nodded and turned his attention to the broken door. He worked silently, repairing the damaged hinge while Sophie watched, unsure if she should offer help or leave him to it. "You're from the city?" he asked suddenly, not looking up from his work. "Yes, Chicago. I worked in marketing until recently." Sophie didn't feel like explaining her unemployment. "What about you? Have you always been a farmer?" Grant was quiet for so long that Sophie thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "No, I used to teach high school science. Moved here 5 years ago." Sophie wanted to ask why he'd made such a drastic change, but something in his manner suggested it wasn't a topic open for discussion. "Well, thank you for fixing this," she said instead. As Grant closed the newly repaired door, he nodded and gathered his tools. "Garden needs watering. It's going to be hot today." With that, he left, disappearing down the path between their properties. Over the next few days, Sophie fell into a routine that surprised her with how comfortable it felt. She woke with the sunrise, fed the chickens, and tended to the garden, which seemed to thrive under her care despite her limited knowledge of plants. In the afternoons, she explored the surrounding woods or sat on the porch reading books she found on Megan's shelves. Grant appeared occasionally, always unexpectedly. She'd look up from weeding to find him watching her from the edge of the garden, or she'd return from a walk to discover the leaky faucet in the kitchen had been fixed. Each time, their interactions were brief, with Grant saying little beyond practical observations or questions. Yet Sophie found herself looking forward to these encounters. There was something about Grant's quiet presence that was both mysterious and comforting. On her 5th day at Oak Hollow, Sophie woke to find a basket of fresh eggs on the porch. No note, but she knew who had left them. She smiled to herself as she made breakfast, wondering about the man who lived next door. Later that afternoon, a summer storm rolled in. Sophie was in the orchard when the first fat raindrops began to fall. She hurried back toward the house, but was drenched by the time she reached the porch. To her surprise, Grant was there, soaked as well, securing the porch furniture that might blow away in the wind. "Get inside," he called over the sound of the rain. "I'll finish up out here." Sophie hesitated, then ran into the house to grab towels. When she returned to the porch, Grant had moved everything away from the edge where rain could reach it. "Here," she said, handing him a towel. "You're soaked." Their fingers brushed as he took it, and Sophie felt a small jolt of electricity between them. Grant's eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither moved. Thunder cracked overhead, breaking the spell. Grant stepped back, running the towel over his wet hair. "Storm will pass quickly," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "But the power might go out. There are candles in the kitchen drawer by the sink and matches in the cup above it." Sophie nodded. "Would you like to come in, wait it out? I could make coffee or—" "No." Grant cut her off, then seemed to reconsider. More gently, he added, "Thank you, but I need to check on my place." As he turned to leave, Sophie blurted out, "Why are you helping me so much? You barely know me." Grant paused at the steps, rain still pouring around him. "I promised Megan I'd look after things." He hesitated, then added, "And it's what neighbors do." With that, he was gone, jogging through the rain toward the path that connected their properties. That night, as predicted, the power went out. Sophie lit candles and sat by the window, watching lightning illuminate the countryside in brief, brilliant flashes. She thought about Grant, wondering what he was doing in his own darkened farmhouse. For the first time in months, Sophie didn't check her phone before going to bed. She didn't think about her ex or her lost job or the uncertainty of her future. Instead, she fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof and thoughts of a quiet farmer with kind eyes. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed everything clean. Sophie found Grant in the garden, checking for damage. "To the plants, everything okay?" she asked, approaching with 2 mugs of coffee. She offered one to him. Grant looked surprised but accepted the mug. Thanks, a few tomato plants took a beating, but most everything survived. He took a sip of coffee. How about the house? All fine, Sophie said, kneeling to examine a fallen tomato stake. The power came back on around midnight. Grant nodded and knelt beside her, their shoulders almost touching as he helped straighten the stake and secure the plant. Working together in comfortable silence, they repaired the storm. Damage to the garden. Sophie found herself stealing glances at Grant, noticing the way the sun brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair, the careful gentleness of his hands on the plants, the rare occasions when his serious expression softened into something close to contentment. 1 week, she had promised herself, but as the days passed and her time at Oak Hollow neared its end, Sophie realized she wasn't ready to leave. The day that marked 1 week at Oak Hollow arrived with golden sunlight and a gentle breeze. Sophie woke early, as had become her habit, and stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mist rise from the fields. Megan had called the night before. "How's everything going?" her cousin had asked. "Great," Sophie replied. "The place is beautiful. And you're okay staying a few more days? My cruise got extended because of some engine trouble. We won't be back until next week." Sophie had agreed quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. She wondered if Megan had heard the eagerness in her voice. Now, looking out over the farm that had begun to feel like more than a temporary refuge, Sophie admitted to herself that Grant Ellison was part of the reason she wanted to stay. There was something about him that drew her in, his quiet strength, the sadness that seemed to live behind his eyes, the way he showed up exactly when she needed help without her having to ask, as if her thoughts had summoned him. Sophie spotted Grant walking up the path carrying a paper bag. Her heart skipped a beat, and she chided herself for reacting like a teenager with a crush. "Morning," he said, climbing the porch steps. He held out the bag. "Brought you some fresh bread. Made it yesterday." "You bake?" Sophie asked, surprised. As she took the bag, the warm, yeasty smell made her stomach growl. The corner of his mouth twitched. Sometimes. Sophie invited him in for breakfast, and to her surprise, he accepted. They ate at the kitchen table, fresh bread with butter and honey, eggs from Grant's chickens, and coffee. Grant was as quiet as ever, but the silence between them felt comfortable now, not awkward. "Megan called last night," Sophie said finally. "Their trip got extended. She asked if I could stay a bit longer." Grant looked up from his plate, his eyes meeting hers. "And?" I said yes. "I don't really have anywhere I need to be right now." Sophie hesitated, then added, "I lost my job the day before I came here." Grant nodded, not offering the usual platitudes people gave when hearing bad news. Instead, he said, "The orchard needs tending. Apple trees are ready for a light pruning. I can show you if you want." Sophie smiled, recognizing his offer for what it was. Not just a task to fill her time, but a reason to stay. "I'd like that." After breakfast, Grant led her to the orchard, where neat rows of apple trees stretched toward the hills. He showed her how to identify branches that needed trimming and demonstrated the proper cutting technique. His hands moved with confidence, strong and sure against the wood. "How did you learn all this?" Sophie asked as she attempted to mimic his technique on a nearby branch. Grant was quiet for a moment before answering. "My wife taught me." The words hung in the air between them. Sophie felt her breath catch. Grant had never mentioned a wife before. "She grew up here," he continued, his voice low. "She knew every tree by heart." He adjusted Sophie's grip on the pruning shears. "Like this, clean cut just above the node." Sophie tried again, making a better cut this time. "Does she still help with the orchard?" she asked cautiously. Grant's face seemed to close off, the openness of a moment ago vanishing behind a mask of control. "She died 3 years ago." "I'm so sorry," Sophie whispered, understanding now the source of the sadness she'd sensed in him. Grant nodded once, then turned back to the trees. They worked in silence for a while, moving from tree to tree. Sophie snuck glances at him, watching the careful way he treated each branch, the gentleness that seemed at odds with his strong, weathered appearance. Later, as they took a break in the shade of a large oak tree, Sophie gathered her courage. "How did she die, if you don't mind me asking?" Grant stared out at the horizon, his jaw tight. For a moment, Sophie thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Storm. Like the one the other night, but worse. Much worse." He took a deep breath. "She was checking on a calf born that morning. Barn roof collapsed. By the time I found her..." His words trailed off. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the grass between them. Grant looked down at their hands, then up at her face. Something shifted in his expression, a small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. "I still talk to her sometimes," he admitted. "Out here in the fields, people in town think I'm crazy, I guess." "I don't think you're crazy," Sophie said softly. "I think that's what love does. It doesn't just disappear when someone's gone." Grant held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her understanding. He didn't pull his hand away. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Sophie came to cherish. Mornings were for farm chores, feeding animals, tending the garden, collecting eggs. Grant often joined her, offering guidance but never taking over. In the afternoons, they worked on projects around the property, fixing the loose boards on the porch, cleaning the gutters, pruning the orchard. Sophie learned that Grant's farm produced organic vegetables and fruits that he sold at farmers' markets in nearby towns. She began helping him harvest and prepare for market days, enjoying the satisfaction of seeing their work transformed into bountiful displays of colorful produce. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, after a long day of harvesting, Sophie asked, "Why did you tell me I could stay forever that first day? You didn't even know me." Grant was quiet for a long time, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was sinking in a blaze of orange and red. "This place," he finally said, gesturing to the farmhouse, the fields, the distant hills, "it was meant for more than just one person's grief." He looked at her then, his expression open in a way she'd never seen before. "When I saw you that first day, something just said you belonged here." Sophie's heart beat faster at his words. She'd never been a person who belonged anywhere. She'd moved from city to city, job to job, relationship to relationship. Always the temporary girl, always ready to leave before she could be left. "I've never stayed anywhere very long," she admitted. "Always thought the next place would be where things finally made sense." "And now?" Grant asked, his voice low. Sophie looked around at the farm that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "Now I'm not so sure running is the answer anymore." The moment hung between them, full of possibility. Then Grant stood, clearing his throat. "It's getting late. I should head back." Sophie nodded, trying to hide her disappointment, but as Grant reached the steps, he turned back. "Market day tomorrow. Could use your help if you're willing," she smiled. "I'd like that." The farmers' market was busier than Sophie expected. Their stand, with its neat displays of organic vegetables, fresh eggs, and jars of honey, attracted a steady stream of customers. Sophie enjoyed talking with people who stopped by, explaining the different varieties of tomatoes or suggesting ways to prepare the unusual squash Grant grew. She noticed how people greeted Grant, with respect, but also a certain distance. A few older women gave Sophie curious looks, whispering behind their hands. Grant ignored them, focusing on arranging produce and making change. "They're wondering who you are," he explained when she mentioned it. "Small town, not much happens. Here." "What should I tell them?" Sophie asked. Grant looked at her, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Whatever you want." The next customer, a gray-haired woman with bright eyes, didn't bother with subtlety. "You must be new. Around here," she said to Sophie while selecting a bunch of carrots. "Just passing through." Before Sophie could answer, Grant spoke. "Sophie's staying at Oak Hollow, helping me with the harvest." The simple way he said it, with no explanation or apology, made Sophie smile. The woman raised her eyebrows, but said nothing more. As the day progressed, Sophie realized she enjoyed being associated with Grant and the farm, enjoyed the feeling of being part of something real and rooted. Later, as they packed up the truck, their sales exceeding expectations, Grant said, "You're good with people. Better than me," Sophie laughed. "That's not saying much, you're not exactly chatty." To her delight, Grant laughed too, a real laugh that transformed his serious face and made his eyes crinkle at the corners. The sound of it warmed Sophie from the inside out. On the drive home, the truck bumping along country roads, Sophie felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. Grant drove with one hand on the wheel, the window down, warm air rushing in. He glanced at her occasionally, as if making sure she was still there, still real. Back at the farm, as they unloaded the truck in the golden light of late afternoon, their hands brushed again and again. Each time, Sophie felt that same electric jolt, that same catch in her breath, and each time Grant's eyes found hers, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. When everything was put away, they stood in the yard between their two properties, neither seeming ready to say goodbye. "Thanks for your help today," Grant said, hands in his pockets. "I enjoyed it," Sophie replied honestly. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words. Grant took a step closer. "Sophie, The sound of a car coming up the driveway interrupted him. They both turned to see a sleek black sedan approaching, entirely out of place in the rural setting. "Are you expecting someone?" Grant asked, frowning. Sophie shook her head, squinting at the car as it parked. When the driver's door opened and a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, she felt the blood drain from her face. "Sophie," the man called, striding toward them with confidence. "There you are. Do you know how hard it was to find this place?" "David," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" Her ex-boyfriend smiled, the same charming smile that had once made her heart race, but now only made her stomach clench. "I came to bring you home, of course." He looked around, taking in the farmhouse, the fields, and Grant with a single dismissive glance. "Whatever vacation this is, it's time to end it. I have great news." Sophie felt frozen in place as David reached her, leaning in to kiss her cheek as if they hadn't broken up a month ago, as if she hadn't been ignoring his texts and calls. "We need to talk," David said, slipping an arm around her waist. "Privately," he added, looking pointedly at Grant. Grant's face had returned to its usual unreadable mask. He nodded once, then turned to leave. "Grant, wait," Sophie called. But David was already steering her toward the house, talking about a new job opportunity, about how he'd realized he'd made a mistake. Sophie looked back over her shoulder to see Grant walking away, his shoulders rigid, his strides long and determined. The sight of him retreating made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. David's voice continued, a stream of words about their future together, about plans he'd made. Sophie turned to face him, trying to focus on what he was saying, but all she could think about was Grant's face, when he'd almost said whatever he'd been about to say before David arrived. As they reached the porch steps, David took her hands in his. "I've had a lot of time to think, Sophie, and I realized what I really want." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I want you. Forever." Sophie stared at the small velvet box in David's hand, her mind spinning. The diamond ring inside caught the last rays of sunlight, throwing off tiny prisms of light. It was exactly the kind of ring she would have wanted 6 months ago. Elegant, expensive, a statement piece that would have impressed her colleagues at the marketing firm. Now looking at it, she felt nothing but confusion. "David, I don't understand," she said, taking a step back. "We broke up, you walked out. You said we wanted different things." David's smile didn't falter. "I made a mistake, Sophie. After you left the city, I realized what I'd lost." He moved closer, taking her hand. "And I have amazing news. Remember Jackson and Meyer? They offered me that VP position and I put in a good word for you. They want to interview you for the marketing director role. It's everything we talked about." Sophie's head was swimming. Jackson and Meyer was one of the top marketing firms in Chicago. 6 months ago, this would have been her dream job. She and David had talked about working there together, climbing the corporate ladder, building the perfect power couple life. "You need to come back with me," David continued, mistaking her silence for consideration. "The interview is on Monday. We can be back in the city by tomorrow night, get you something stunning to wear, and—" "David, stop," Sophie interrupted. "This is all happening too fast. You show up out of nowhere with a ring and a job offer, expecting me to just drop everything and come with you." David looked around, his expression incredulous. "Drop what exactly? This?" He gestured to the farmhouse and fields. "Sophie, this isn't you. You're just going through some phase because of the job loss, It's time to come back to real life. His words stung, especially because part of her wondered if he was right. Was this just a temporary escape? Was she fooling herself thinking she could belong in a place like Oak Hollow? "I need time to think," she said finally. "You can stay for dinner if you want, but I'm not making any decisions tonight." David's smile tightened, but he nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Inside the farmhouse, Sophie moved mechanically around the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner while David talked about Chicago, about friends they had in common, about the exciting future that awaited them. She nodded and made appropriate sounds, of interest, but her mind was elsewhere, down the path that led to Grant's farm. After dinner, David insisted on opening a bottle of wine he'd brought. "To celebrate," he said, though Sophie had made it clear there was nothing to celebrate yet. As they sat on the porch, the night air cool around them, David seemed to notice her distraction. Who was that guy anyway? The farmer? Grant Ellison, Sophie said, his name feeling important on her lips. "He owns the property next door." David raised an eyebrow. "Seemed pretty interested in you." Sophie took a sip of wine, unsure how to respond. Were Grant's feelings that obvious to an outsider? Or was David just being possessive? "He's just a neighbor," she said finally, the words tasting false. "He's been helping me with the farm chores." David laughed. "Farm chores? Never thought I'd hear those words from you." He moved closer on the porch swing. "Remember that weekend in the Hamptons? You complained about having to walk on the beach because the sand got in your designer shoes." Sophie did remember. She remembered who she'd been just weeks ago, a woman who cared about appearances, who measured success in promotions and brand name purchases, who'd never gotten her hands dirty growing anything. "People change," she said softly. "Not that much," David countered, finishing his wine. "Look, I get it. This place is charming in a rustic way. But Sophie, be realistic. You in overalls, feeding chickens for the rest of your life? That's not who you are." His words echoed her own doubts. David had known her for years. He knew her ambitions, her love of city life, her desire for recognition in her career. Was he right? Was she just playing pretend here? "It's getting late," she said, standing up. "The guest room is made up for you." David caught her hand. "Sophie," he said, his voice gentler now. "I know this is sudden, but I've never been more sure of anything. We belong together. Think about it overnight." He leaned in and kissed her cheek, then headed inside. Sophie stayed on the porch, looking out into the darkness, toward where she knew Grant's farmhouse stood. Morning arrived with a clarity Sophie hadn't expected. She'd lain awake most of the night, turning over her options, examining her feelings. When she finally rose and looked out the window at Oak Hollow bathed in early sunlight, she knew she needed to talk to Grant before making any decision. David was still asleep when she slipped out of the house and headed down the path to Grant's farm. Her heart pounded as she approached his door, unsure of her welcome after the way they'd parted the day before. She knocked, but there was no answer. Walking around to the back, she found a note tacked to the door of his barn. "Gone to North Ridge Market. Back afternoon." Disappointment washed over her. North Ridge was the next town over, nearly an hour's drive. Grant wouldn't be back for hours. When she returned to Megan's house, David was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked up with a smile. "Good morning, early riser now, are you?" "Just checking on the chickens," Sophie lied, accepting the cup he offered. "I was thinking," David said, sitting across from her at the table, "why don't we take a drive today, see some of the countryside? You can show me what's so appealing about this place." Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Maybe getting away from the farm for a few hours would help clear her head. "There's a nice lake about 30 minutes from here," she suggested. They spent the morning driving through the rolling hills, stopping at a small town for lunch, then continuing to the lake Grant had once mentioned to her. It was beautiful, crystal, clear water surrounded by trees with mountains rising in the distance. As they walked along the shore, David took her hand. For a moment, Sophie let him. The familiar feel of his fingers intertwined with hers, bringing back memories of their 3 years together. "We were good together, weren't we?" David asked, looking out over the water. Sophie considered the question, honestly. "Sometimes," she answered. "But we wanted different things, David. You said so yourself when you left. I was wrong, he insisted. Sophie, I've never stopped loving you. These past weeks without you have been torture. Sophie looked at him, handsome, successful, saying all the right words. Yet something felt off, like he was playing a role he thought she wanted to see. What's really going on, David? She asked. Why now? Why track me down at a farm in the middle of nowhere when you could have called or texted? David dropped her hand, sighing. Fine. You want the truth? Jackson and Meyer wants us as a package deal. The power couple angle. It's part of their rebranding strategy. The honesty was refreshing, but it stung. So this is about the job? No. Yes. Partly. David ran a hand through his hair. Look, the job opportunity forced me to really think about us, and I realized I do want you back. The ring, the proposal, that's real. Sophie wasn't sure what to believe anymore. They drove back mostly in silence, arriving at Oak Hollow in the late afternoon. As they pulled up to the farmhouse, Sophie's heart skipped when she saw Grant's truck parked nearby. David noticed her reaction. Your farmer friend is back, he observed dryly. Sophie got out of the car quickly, scanning the property for Grant. She spotted him by the garden, his back to them as he examined the tomato plants. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward him, hearing David's footsteps follow behind her. Grant, she called softly. He turned, his expression guarded when he saw David behind her. Sophie was just checking on the tomatoes after the rain. His eyes flicked to David, then back to her. Didn't mean to intrude. You're not intruding, Sophie said quickly. This is your farm too. Grant nodded once, his jaw tight. Got some work to finish. Just wanted to make sure everything was okay here. He started to turn away. Grant, wait, Sophie called after him. I was hoping we could talk. David stepped forward then, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. We were actually in the middle of making some plans, he said smoothly. Sophie and I have a lot to discuss about our future. Grant's face showed no reaction, but Sophie saw a muscle in his jaw clench. Of course, he said stiffly. I'll leave you to it. That's not what Sophie began, but Grant was already walking away, his strides long and determined. Frustration and anger bubbled up inside her. Anger at David for his presumption, at Grant for walking away, and at herself for not knowing what she truly wanted. What was that about, she demanded, turning to David. David shrugged. Just letting him know where things stand. Sophie, you can't seriously be interested in that guy. You don't know him, Sophie shot back. You don't know anything about my life here. Because you've been here all of what? 2 weeks, David countered. This isn't your life, Sophie. It's a vacation from reality. His words hit too close to her own doubts. Was that all this was? A temporary escape from her real life. That evening, tension hung in the air as they ate dinner. David kept the conversation focused on Chicago, on the opportunities waiting for them, on the life they could build together. Sophie listened, trying to picture herself returning to that world. The rush of the city, the pressure of a high-profile job, the social expectations. Once, it had all seemed so important. Now she found herself thinking of simpler pleasures, the satisfaction of harvesting vegetables she'd helped grow, the peace of watching sunsets from the porch, the warmth in Grant's eyes when he looked at her. After dinner, David produced the ring box again, setting it on the table between them. I know it's sudden, he said, but sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. The job interview is Monday. Say yes and we can start our new life together. Sophie looked at the ring, then up at David. I need to think, she said. Alone. I'm going for a walk. Before he could protest, she was out the door, heading toward the orchard. The evening air was cool against her skin as she walked among the apple trees, their branches heavy with fruit nearly ready for harvest. This orchard that Grant had taught her to tend, where he'd first told her about his wife, where she'd begun to feel a connection to the land and to him. At the far end of the orchard, a fence separated Oak Hollow from Grant's property, in the E. Fading light, Sophie saw him there, mending a section damaged by the recent storm. The sight of him, solid, real, working with quiet purpose, made her heart ache with a clarity she hadn't expected. She approached slowly, stopping on her side. Of the fence! Grant! He looked up, surprise crossing his features before he schooled them back to neutrality. "Sophie, I need to talk to you," she said, "about everything that's happening." Grant set down his tools and came to stand opposite her, the fence still between them. "Not much to talk about. Your boyfriend came back for you. Sounds like he's offering everything you wanted." "Everything I thought I wanted," Sophie corrected. "This place, it's changed me. Or maybe it just showed me who I really am." She took a deep breath. "I need to know something. That first day, when you said I could stay forever, did you mean it?" Grant looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "I meant it." "Why?" Sophie pressed. "You didn't know me at all." Grant's gaze didn't waver. "Because this place has been too quiet for too long. Because you looked at it like it was something special, not just another patch of dirt." He paused, then added softly, "Because I hadn't heard anyone laugh in that house for 3 years, and I thought maybe you could change that." His honesty took her breath away. "Grant, Sophie," David's voice called from the direction of the farmhouse. "Where are you?" Sophie closed her eyes briefly, frustration washing over her. When she opened them, Grant had stepped back from the fence. "Your future's calling," he said, his voice carefully neutral again. "Grant, please," Sophie began, but David was getting closer, calling her name. "This place feels like it's healing me," she said quickly, desperately. "But maybe I was never meant to stay anywhere too long." Grant didn't beg her to stay. He simply took off his work gloves and walked toward her, his movements deliberate. He stopped just on his side of the fence, close enough that Sophie could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "You said you'd stay for 1 week," he said, his voice deep and certain. "I've waited 3 years to hear someone laugh in this house again. So if you choose to go, I'll understand, but if you stay—" He reached across the fence, his fingers just brushing hers. "I'll spend every day proving why you were meant to." Sophie's heart pounded as she stepped forward, the decision crystallizing in her mind even as she moved. But before she could speak, "Sophie!" Megan's voice called from the porch, startling them both. "Sophie, there's someone here for you." Sophie turned to see her cousin standing on the porch, waving frantically. Beside her stood David, and in front of him— "Oh no," Sophie whispered. The third person on the porch was her former boss, Richard Turner, the man who had fired her just weeks ago. "What is he doing here?" Sophie asked, bewildered. Grant's face hardened as he looked toward the house. "Seems like your past is determined to find you," he said quietly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the growing darkness of his property. Sophie watched him go, her chest tight with unspoken words. Then, squaring her shoulders, she headed back to the farmhouse to face whatever new complication had arrived. As she approached, Richard stepped forward, all business in his crisp suit despite the rural setting. "Sophie, just the person I need to see. Your friend David here tells me you might be interested in coming back to work. I have a proposition for you." David beamed at her. "Isn't it great? Richard flew all the way out here to meet with us." Sophie looked between them, then at her cousin Megan, who seemed both confused and concerned. "Richard fired me," Sophie said, bluntly to David. "Why would I want to work with him again?" Richard had the grace to look embarrassed. "A regrettable decision made under financial pressure. But things have changed. We've secured new funding, and with the Jackson and Meyer connection, David mentioned we could form a powerful partnership." Sophie felt like she was watching a play unfold, a drama about corporate ambitions and strategic alliances, a drama she no longer wanted any part in. "I think we should discuss this inside," David suggested, placing his hand on Sophie's back. To guide her, she stepped away from his touch. "Actually, I have something to say first." She looked at David, then at Richard, and finally at Megan. "I'm not going back to Chicago." David's smile faltered. "Sophie, don't be hasty. At least hear the offer." "No," Sophie interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I don't need to hear it. I've made my decision." The silence that followed Sophie's declaration was heavy. David's smile disappeared completely, replaced by a look of confusion and anger. You can't be serious, he said, shaking his head. Sophie, we're talking about your career, your future, our future together. I am serious, Sophie replied, a strange calm settling over her. I'm staying here. Richard cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss this inside, where we can go over the details of the offer. Sophie, you really need to hear what's on the table before making any decisions. Sophie looked at her cousin, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Megan, when did you get back? Just an hour ago, Megan replied. The cruise ended early. I was going to call, but then these gentlemen showed up looking for you. She gave Sophie a questioning look. What's going on? It's a long story, Sophie said. And yes, let's go inside. In the farmhouse kitchen, Sophie made coffee while the others settled around the table. David placed the ring box in front of him, a silent reminder of what he was offering. Richard pulled out a folder with papers. Contracts and proposals, Sophie assumed. Sophie, Richard began once they all had coffee, I understand your hesitation, given how things ended at the firm. But this is a fresh start. We're looking at a major expansion, working directly with Jackson and Meyer on their biggest accounts. He slid a paper across the table. This is what we're prepared to offer you. Sophie glanced at the figure. It was more money than she'd ever made, almost double her previous salary. That's just the beginning, David added eagerly. Think about it, Sophie. The house we could buy, the vacations we could take, everything we talked about. And the ring? Sophie asked, nodding toward the velvet box. David smiled. The final piece. We'll be the power couple of Chicago's marketing world. It's perfect. Sophie looked at the three faces watching her. David's confident, expectant, Richard's calculating, and Megan's concerned and confused. What about what I want? Sophie asked quietly. This is what you want, David insisted. The Sophie I know has been working toward this her whole career. Maybe I'm not that Sophie anymore, she replied. She took a deep breath and continued. The past 2 weeks here have shown me something different, a life that's not about climbing corporate ladders or impressing people with job titles, a life that's real and grounded and, she hesitated, then said it, full of love. David's expression darkened. Love? For what, chickens and tomato plants? His eyes narrowed. Or for that farmer next door? His name is Grant, Sophie said firmly. And yes, I have feelings for him. Real feelings that aren't based on career, advantages or social status. You barely know him, David exclaimed. Sophie, you're throwing away everything for a man you met 2 weeks ago? That's insane. It's not just about Grant, Sophie explained, though her heart raced at admitting her feelings aloud. It's about who I am here, who I can be. I've spent years trying to be someone who impresses people, who fits into a world of fancy dinners and designer clothes. But here, she gestured to the kitchen window, through which the orchard was visible in the distance. Here I feel like I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be. Richard, sensing the shift in the conversation, gathered his papers. I can see you need time to consider. The offer will remain open until Monday. No need, Sophie said, smiling gently. I appreciate you coming all this way, but my answer is final. I'm staying at Oak Hollow. Richard nodded stiffly and stood. In that case, I'll leave you to it. David, do you need a ride back to town? David remained seated, staring at Sophie with disbelief. You're really choosing this over us, over everything we planned? I'm choosing me, Sophie said simply. The me I've discovered here. David's face hardened. Fine, have your little farm fantasy. But when the novelty wears off and you realize you've made the biggest mistake of your life, don't come crawling back. He snatched up the ring box and followed Richard to the door. Sophie felt Megan's hand on her shoulder as they watched the two men drive away. Well, her cousin said, that was quite a scene. I think you have some explaining to do. Over cups of fresh coffee, Sophie told Megan everything. About losing her job, about the peace she'd found at Oak Hollow, and about Grant. As she spoke, the rightness of her decision settled deeper into her bones. So you're in love with the neighbor, Megan said when Sophie finished. The quiet, brooding farmer who barely speaks. Sophie laughed. He's not always quiet. Not when it matters. Megan smiled. I've known Grant for years, ever since he moved, here with Laura. He was different then, more open, always laughing. After she died, she shook her head. I worried he'd never find his way back. But these past 2 weeks, I've seen glimpses of the old Grant. I think that's because of you. He told me about Laura, Sophie said softly. About the storm, Megan nodded. It devastated him. This community tried to help, but Grant just withdrew into himself and his work. She squeezed Sophie's hand. If you love him, really love him, don't let him push you away. He's had plenty of practice at that. I don't even know if he feels the same, Sophie admitted. What if I'm just romanticizing this whole situation? 2 weeks isn't long enough to really know someone, is it? Sometimes 2 weeks is more than enough, Megan said wisely. And sometimes years isn't enough. It's not about time. It's about seeing someone clearly and letting them see you. Sophie thought about Grant, how he noticed things others missed, how he showed up exactly when she needed help, how his rare smiles transformed his entire face. I need to talk to him, Sophie said, standing up. Now, before I lose my nerve. Go, Megan encouraged. I'll be here when you get back. And Sophie? She smiled warmly. For what it's worth, I think you belong here too. The night was clear, stars speckling the sky above as Sophie walked the path to Grant's farm. Lights glowed in his windows, a beacon guiding her forward. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps were sure. She knocked on his door, then waited, fighting the urge to run. When the door swung open, revealing Grant in worn jeans and a faded t-shirt, Sophie momentarily forgot all the words she'd planned to say. Sophie, he said, surprise evident in his voice. I thought you'd be packing. For Chicago. She shook her head. No packing, no Chicago. Grant's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark of hope he seemed afraid to let ignite. Your visitors left. They did, Sophie confirmed, with their job offers and engagement rings, none of which I accepted. Grant stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. They stood face to face in the soft glow of the porch light, so close Sophie could see the stubble on his jaw, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow she'd never noticed before. Why, he asked, the single word holding the weight of so many questions. Because none of it felt right, Sophie answered honestly. Not David, not the job, not the life they were offering. She took a deep breath. Not when compared to what I've found here. And what's that? Grant's voice was low, careful. Sophie gestured to the land around them, to the stars above, to the space between them. Peace, purpose, a place that feels like it could be home. She met his eyes directly. You. The word hung in the air between them. Grant's expression softened, the walls he kept so carefully constructed beginning to crumble. Sophie, he began, then stopped, as if the words were too difficult to form. He tried again. I've been alone a long time, got used to it. Thought that's how it would always be. His eyes never left hers. Then you showed up in those mismatched boots, talking about staying just 1 week. Sophie smiled at the memory. I was so sure I wouldn't get attached. And now, Grant asked, taking a step closer. Now I don't want to leave, Sophie admitted. I want to see the orchard through all 4 seasons. I want to learn how to can tomatoes for winter. I want to... She hesitated, then finished in a whisper, Hear you laugh again. Grant reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Laura used to say that hearts are like gardens. They need tending, even after storms. His thumb traced the line of Sophie's cheekbone. My heart's been fallow a long time, but these past weeks with you, it's starting to grow again. Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes. Are you sure? I don't want to be someone who's just passing through your life. I've never been more sure of anything, Grant said, his voice strong and certain. Then, with a hint of the smile that transformed his face, he added, I told you that first day, stay as long as you want, or forever. Forever sounds good, Sophie whispered, and then Grant was kissing her, gently at first, then, with a growing passion that spoke of healing and hope and futures unfolding before them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Grant rested his forehead against hers. Stay tonight, he said softly, and tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that. Sophie nodded, her heart full. "I will." As they walked hand in hand into Grant's house, soon to be their house, Sophie felt the last pieces of her old self falling away, not lost, but transformed like seeds buried in rich soil, ready to grow into something stronger and more beautiful than before. Morning arrived with golden light spilling through the windows. Sophie woke in Grant's arms, the unfamiliar bedroom, slowly coming into focus. For a moment she wondered if it had all been a dream, the declarations, the decisions, the night they'd spent talking until dawn. Planning a future neither had believed possible just weeks before. But then Grant stirred, his arms tightening around her, and Sophie knew it was all wonderfully real. "Morning," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Morning," she replied, snuggling closer. "Know what today is?" Grant thought for a moment. "Sunday." Sophie smiled. "It's 3 weeks since I arrived at Oak Hollow, the day I was supposed to leave." Grant's expression grew serious. "Any regrets?" "Not one," Sophie assured him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "Except maybe that I ever thought 1 week would be enough time here." Grant's smile, the full, unguarded smile she'd come to treasure, lit up his face. "Well, now you have all the time in the world, forever if you want it." "Forever," Sophie agreed, the word no longer frightening but full of promise. "Sounds perfect." Later that day, as they walked through the orchard hand in hand, the autumn sun warming their shoulders, Sophie spotted Megan on the porch of the farmhouse, waving to them. "I guess I should move my things from Megan's house," Sophie said. Grant nodded. "Or we could expand," he suggested. "Connect the properties, make one big farm." Sophie smiled up at him, seeing not just the present moment but all the possibilities stretching before them. A home built together, seasons changing, love growing stronger with each passing day. Oak Hollow and Ellison Farm, she mused. "I like the sound of that. Sophie Blair and Grant Ellison," he replied, squeezing her hand. "I like the sound of that even better." As they reached Megan, who was beaming knowingly at them, Sophie felt a contentment she'd never known before. She had promised herself she wouldn't get attached, wouldn't put down roots in this quiet corner of the world. But sometimes, Sophie realized the heart knows where it belongs long before the mind catches up. Sometimes, what begins as just 1 week becomes a lifetime. And sometimes, against all odds and expectations, you find forever in the place and the person you least expected the end.